When we think of the concept of total football, we usually, and rightly, associate it with the Dutch team at the 1974 World Cup and the Ajax side of the early 1970s. Both teams were spearheaded at various stages by Rinus Michels, widely regarded as the innovator of total football, and Johan Cruyff, whose deft touch, clinical finishing, and all-round aura made him the perfect figure to lead those two sides. The Amsterdam club won 3 of their 4 European Cup/Champions League titles in their history between 1971 and 1973 using the total football system, and although the Netherlands established their reputation as the bridesmaids of football by finishing as runners-up at the 1974 World Cup, they had won the hearts and minds of football lovers across the globe with their style of play. However, although the impact of that Ajax team on the development of total football cannot be underestimated or downplayed, there is another club who, at the exact same time, played almost as pivotal a role in its development as the Amsterdam club, but whose contributions have somewhat gone under the radar over the years. The team in question, as you can tell by the title of this video, is Feyenoord, who, coincidentally enough, are Ajax's biggest rivals. Managed by another tactical mastermind of our era in the form of Ernst Happel, Feyenoord formed a legendary duopoly over the Dutch game alongside their Der Klassieker rivals, and from 1965 to 1974, they were the only 2 teams to win the Eredivisie. Think of it as a Beat Generation era Man United v Arsenal, but with Michels and Happel being the Ferguson and Wenger of that particular battle. But statistics alone don't tell the full story, as there were so many other elements to explain why that Feyenoord team enjoyed so much success and contributed to the renaissance of Dutch football during that time, and, of course, to the phenomenon of total football. This is the story of the influential yet underappreciated Feyenoord team of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Before we get into specifically talking about Feyenoord, it is worth briefly discussing the absolute state that was Dutch football prior to the 1960s, just to give a little bit of context. The national team had only qualified for 2 World Cups up to that point, namely the 1934 and 1938 editions, and on both counts they were knocked out in the first round by Switzerland and Czechoslovakia at those respective tournaments, and they failed to qualify for another World Cup until 1974. What's more, the country remained strictly amateur and saw a flux of talent head overseas in search of better pay, or rather, pay at all. And that, combined with the KNVB's self-enforced rule that no one could play for the national team if they either earned money or played abroad, meant that their progress as a footballing country was stifled. In 1954, a rival football association, which allowed professionalism right from the get-go, was formed, with 10 of the country's major teams signing up to it in protest against the KNVB. Scared about the consequences of their strict adherence to amateurism in line with this new association's creation, the KNVB finally relented and agreed to merge the 2 organisations together and allow professionalism at the top level. This didn't lead to a change in fortunes for the national team though, and in 1963 they hit a new low when they were humiliated 3-2 on aggregate by minnows Luxembourg in qualification for Euro 1964, despite playing at home in both legs. Dutch football was in a stupor, and it looked difficult to see how it could come back from that particular setback, or indeed challenge the world's elite. However, wider societal changes at the time began to have an impact on how football was played, and those effects would start seeping through after that disastrous Euro 64 qualification campaign. After World War II had ended, a more liberal and relaxed society started to emerge after rules concerning state privacy and ethnic differences were lifted, and this freedom resulted in greater economic prosperity and, as David Winner describes it, a cultural boom. This translated over to the football pitches, where teams started to play with much more fluidity and expression, especially at Ajax, where Rinus Michels' appointment in 1964 would eventually lead to one of the finest club sides ever assembled. But it wasn't just Ajax who would be the sporting purveyors of this newfound liberation, as across the country, a team from Rotterdam also laid down their marker, both domestically and on the continent, with their own version of total football. And that team was Feyenoord. They kicked off the 1960s with 2 consecutive Eredivisie titles in 1961 and 1962, earning them qualification to the European Cup on both counts, and they managed to reach the semi-finals in 1962-63 before losing to Benfica. This came under the guidance of Franz Fuss, an Austrian who some believe was the first professional, and indeed the first foreigner, to play a game in Holland's top flight. But after that European Cup run, he left the club and was replaced as manager by Romanian Norberto Hudling. After his year in charge yielded no silverware whatsoever, another Austrian, this time by the name of Willy Kment, took control in 1964, and immediately he won the Rotterdam club a domestic double, the first in their history. Another would follow in 1969, this time with Ben Peters, the former coach of the club's youth team, at the helm, achieving the second highest points tally in Eredivisie history with 57 points from their 34 games in the process. Keep in mind this was in the era of 2 points for a win. However, with their first season in the European Cup since 1965-66, when they were knocked out in the first round by Real Madrid, on the horizon, the club decided that they wanted a manager with much more experience and authority than Peters. As such, they returned into his previous role as youth team coach and appointed the man who would turn out to be the most pivotal figure in the club's history, another Austrian, careless please, by the name of Ernst Happel. One of the most enigmatic characters in football history, Happel had a decent career as a centre-back, spending all of his playing years barring one with Rapid Wien and winning 6 Austrian Bundesliga titles, as well as winning 51 caps for Austria and forming a part of their 1954 World Cup squad, which came in third. His first managerial post came in 1962 when he took the reins of ADO Den Haag, and within 3 years of his appointment, he had taken them from perennial relegation candidates to third in the league, topping off his 7-year spell with them by winning the Dutch Cup in 1968. The year after, Feyenoord came calling, and the coach responded with a very simple message. The future? Feyenoord. Kind regards, yours, Ernst Happel. A notorious chain smoker and cognac enthusiast, Happel was a man of very few words who hated speaking about tactics or his approach to the game, preferring instead to let his actions and practical nature do the talking. At his first training session with Feyenoord, he lined up some bottles on a crossbar and hit every single one of them first time. Immediately, the players knew that Happel was not a man to be taken lightly. Whenever he did make speeches to his players, they tended to be brief and to the point rather than anything elaborate, with his most famous quote being, "Stop talking, just play football." In fact, when he was in charge of the Netherlands national team at the 1978 World Cup, his pre-match talk for each game apparently consisted of just 3 words. Gentlemen, 2 points. When he arrived at Feyenoord, he already had a great squad at his disposal, which he sought to mould in his image. Rinus Israel, whom Happel would make captain, was the club's defensive rock who was also blessed with great skill on the ball, leading him to play in the sweeper role and form a formidable centre-back partnership with Theo Lazaroms, which conceded just 21 league goals in 1968-69 and 22 the following season. Wim Jansen was the team's anchor in defensive midfield, providing the link between defence and midfield, breaking up play with inch-perfect tackles and giving licence for those in front of him to go on the attack. Up front, they had Swede Ove Kundvall, a nimble and pacey striker who had finished as the top scorer in the Eredivisie in 1968 and 1969, scoring 58 goals across those 2 seasons. The star of the show, however, was midfielder Wim van Hanegem, who Feyenoord fans claim was better than Johan Cruyff ever was. Nicknamed the Crooked owing to his bandy legs and ability to curl the ball with consummate ease, Van Hanegem was actually set to join Ajax in 1968, but Michels turned him down on account of him being too slow and one-dimensional, and he moved to Feyenoord that summer instead. As you may have been able to guess from Michels' assessment of Van Hanegem, he was not exactly blessed with pace, but what he lacked in mobility, he made up for with guile, intelligence, and creativity. He primarily operated as a number 8 who would dictate the play with his phenomenal passing range and vision, but he was also able to break up opposition attacks with a perfectly timed tackle. The midfielder would go on to become Feyenoord's key player during their golden age, and he formed a close-knit relationship with his coach and indeed his teammates. Unsurprisingly, Happel therefore decided that a complete overhaul of the squad wasn't necessary, although he did make some additions nonetheless, including Schalke playmaker Frans Hazel and Eddie Tretel, a goalkeeper who was touted to replace the incumbent captain Eddie Pieters Graafland. Another new arrival was Ajax left-back Theo van Duivenbode, who was deemed surplus to requirements by Michels owing to a supposed lack of physicality, and then became just the 3rd player in history to move directly between the 2 rivals. Van Duivenbode would get his revenge though, scoring the winner in his first Der Klassiker game in Feyenoord's colours in November 1969. Whilst the squad may not have been changed much, the style of play most definitely did. At the time, most Dutch teams were playing with a 4-2-4 formation, with 2 holding midfielders covering for 2 attack-minded fullbacks and giving license for the 4 forwards to remain up the pitch. Happel threw that idea out the window, instead using a 4-3-3 formation and dropping Van Hanegem back from striker, where he had played the previous season, to an advanced playmaker role where he could dictate the flow of the game much more easily. Hazard was also trained to play more of a free role as a number 10, a position which was quite frankly unheard of in Dutch football at that point, and told to frequently interchange positions with striker Kindval, making it a nightmare for defences to track their movements. Happel encouraged his team to play on the front foot, focusing on attacking with a slow and patient build-up rather than with lightning-fast counter-attacks. The players were expected to play with fluidity and creativity, something which tied into the aforementioned societal boom that created a more liberal and free-spirited country throughout the 1960s. The fullbacks frequently joined in with the attacks. Hazel and Van Hanegem were told to work in between the lines and look for spaces in which to operate, and the wingers, namely Henk Wery and Koen Moylein, were instructed to cut inside and use their natural intuition and ball control to scythe through the hearts of opposition defences. Whilst the team remained calm and patient on the ball, it was a completely different story when they were off the ball. Happel introduced a high-intensity pressing style that meant his players would swarm around key opposition players whenever they had the ball, as well as deploying a high defensive line and an offside trap. He had learned how to successfully deploy an offside trap during his playing days when, after a game in which his Rapid Wien side were thrashed 5-0 by Brazilian outfit Vasco da Gama in 1949, the team began to use Happel as a playmaker from the back, probably the equivalent of what we call a ball-playing centre-half today, and defend high up the pitch to catch their opponents offside. This would form a pivotal part of his own total football system, as it made sure his team would defend aggressively and on the front foot and regain the ball as quickly as possible. With Happel's ideas firmly in place, Feyenoord set out to defend their Eredivisie title and make a splash in the 1969-70 European Cup. Unfortunately, on the domestic front, they were surprisingly knocked out in the second round of the Dutch Cup, and they came in second behind Ajax in the league, despite losing just once all season. Their opponents would frequently set up with a defensive shape to counteract the threat that Feyenoord posed, something which ultimately led to them drawing 11 times that season, and they trailed their rivals by 5 points come the end of the campaign. However, one game against Ajax in April 1970 changed the course of total football for good and led Rinus Michels to drastically alter his ideas about how his team should be constructed. Ajax came into this particular clash knowing a win would virtually guarantee them the Eredivisie title, but after 70 minutes they found themselves 3-1 down and struggling against Feyenoord's fluidity. Michels was still using a 4-2-4 formation that meant that his players didn't have quite the same freedom to express themselves on the pitch as their opponents had, and this game finally prompted him to make the necessary switch to 4-3-3 so that he could implement his ideas much more constructively. To accommodate this switch in formation, he signed Johan Neeskens to fill that vacant midfield role, essentially making Neeskens the Hazel of Ajax's project. Ajax eventually came back to draw that particular game 3-3 and, as mentioned earlier, would go on to win the league that year. But without that start wake-up call, and subsequently without that stylistic change, I highly doubt they would have won 3 straight European Cups, even with the likes of Cruyff, Neeskens and Ruud Krol at their disposal. Whilst domestic success didn't immediately come to Feyenoord and Happel, their European Cup run was making a lot of people sit up and take note. They began their campaign with a 16-2 aggregate annihilation of Icelandic outfit KR Reykjavik, but in the next round they were pitted against an AC Milan team that had won the European Cup the previous season, winning 4-1 in the final against, coincidentally enough, Ajax. Happel knew that Van Hanegem and Janssen needed to negate the influence of Milan's star midfielders, namely Giovanni Lodetti and Gianni Rivera, for his side to stand any chance of winning. With Janssen marking Rivera like a hawk, it meant that Milan's play was stifled and gaps began to appear at the back, which the Feyenoord players could exploit. They only lost the first leg in Milan 1-0, and when they returned to De Kruip for the second game, the Dutch side dominated proceedings. They were rewarded when Janssen's cross-turn shot looped over the Milan goalkeeper to level the game up, and 8 minutes from time, some wing wizardry from Moulijn created space for a cross which landed squarely on the head of Van Hanegem, whose header flew in and proved to be the match winner. In the quarter-finals, they came up against Feyenoord Berlin, and once again, they overturned the first leg one-goal deficit away from home to progress through to the semi-finals, where Legia Warsaw would lie in wait for them. In farcically wet conditions, both teams struggled in the goalless first leg, but in the second leg, another rain-affected encounter, Feyenoord netted twice through Van Hanegem and Hazel to set up a showdown with Celtic at the San Siro. The Scots, who had won the European Cup 3 years prior and had 7 of their starting 11 from that game still in their ranks, were very confident, with manager Jock Stein even suggesting that Feyenoord didn't have the fight, calibre or fitness of Leeds, whom Celtic had beaten in the semi-finals to reach the showpiece event. Much like against Milan, Happel knew that reducing the influence of their opponent's star man, in this case tricky winger Jimmy Johnstone, was crucial to any chance of Feyenoord winning. He set 3 people to mark Johnstone whenever he was on the ball, as well as instructing Moorline to constantly pressure Celtic's fullback David Hay, meaning that whatever service could go to Johnstone was severely limited. Although Celtic took the lead through Tommy Gell on the half-hour mark, Israel powered home a header just 2 minutes later to level the scores, and as the Dutch side continued to dominate, it seemed a case of when, and not if, the second goal would arrive. However, the teams couldn't be separated after 19 minutes, with Feyenoord being denied on a few occasions by Celtic's goalkeeper, Evan Williams, as well as striking the post twice, and extra time subsequently beckoned. As both teams began to tire, mistakes and chances became more frequent, and 1 3 minutes from time ultimately led to the winning goal. Celtic's captain Billy McNeil, misjudging the flight of a free kick, frantically stuck out a hand in the penalty box in an attempt to divert the ball away, but even though the contact was blatantly obvious, the referee noticed that the ball was heading towards Kindval and allowed play to go on. Benefiting from the advantage, Kindval slotted home past Williams, and there was no time for Celtic to come back. Feyenoord had become the first Dutch team to win the European Cup. After the match, the Scots acknowledged that they had severely underestimated their opponents and congratulated them on their success. Johnstone specifically approached Van Hanegem to tell him that they deserved to win, and Stein admitted in his press conference after the match, "Celtic has not lost to Feyenoord, I have lost to Happel." Wim Jansen, who would later go on to manage Celtic but who sadly passed away earlier this year, would later speak of the influence that this victory had on teams from across the continent, saying, quote, "It was the moment when a club from a different country, outside of the big European leagues, won, and everybody from those countries started believing they could too." Close quote. Feyenoord would back this success up the next season by reclaiming the Eredivisie title, finishing 4 points ahead of Ajax, with Kindval top scoring once again with 24 goals. They also added the Intercontinental Cup to their trophy cabinet after defeating Estudiantes of Argentina, albeit it was in a very violent encounter which saw 200 armed police officers guard the Dutch team owing to the hostility from the crowd in Argentina. In the second leg, Joop van Dele, 2 minutes after scoring what ultimately turned out to be the winner, had his glasses removed by an Estudiantes player who threw it to one of his teammates, who then smashed them to pieces. But Van Dele had the last laugh when his team held on to their lead, and his broken glasses are now on display in Feyenoord's club museum. Stunningly though, they were eliminated in the first round of the European Cup in 1970-71 on away goals to Romanian minnows UT Arad, a competition which Ajax would go on to win to kickstart a hat-trick of European Cup titles as they started to overtake their rivals on the domestic and continental fronts. Feyenoord went trophyless in 1971-72 and 1972-73, with a few key players departing during that time, including Kindval, who returned to his homeland of Sweden, and in 1973, Happel stepped down to take up a post at Sevilla. Feyenoord's golden days were almost over, but they saved one last flourish in the 1973-74 campaign with a league and UEFA Cup double. In the Dutch squad for the 1974 World Cup, Rinus Michels chose 7 Feyenoord players to come with him to West Germany, compared to 6 from his former club Ajax, albeit only 3 of those 7 players made any significant contributions in their run to the final, where they lost 2-1 to the hosts. Ever since then, Feyenoord have had to play third fiddle to Ajax and PSV, winning just 4 league titles in almost 50 years, and although they added a second UEFA Cup trophy to their cabinet in 2001-02, they haven't got past the round of 16 in either the European Cup or the Champions League since 1971-72, and they lost the inaugural Europa Conference League final to Roma last month. Ultimately though, their vintage squad of the late 1960s and early 1970s provided the foundations for one of the most influential and talked about styles of play in football history. Without the genius of Ernst Happel, that game against Ajax in April 1970, which finally made Rinus Michels change his ways to incorporate his ideas much more emphatically with both Ajax and the Netherlands national team, and that elusive European Cup success that put Dutch football well and truly on the map, football in the Netherlands would probably be a long way behind where it is right now, and it certainly wouldn't have been as pivotal to the development of football across the world, not least just as one example with Pep Guardiola's all-conquering Barcelona team from 2008 to 2012, as it has proven to be. Of course, as I implied at the start, this is not a video discrediting any of Ajax's achievements during that time, but rather making a point that disregarding Feyenoord's contributions to the shape of football to come is nothing more than foolish. And that just about wraps up today's video looking at Feyenoord's golden generation of the late 1960s and early 1970s. If you have any more stories that you want me to explore or anything you want me to profile, particular teams or players or anything like that, let me know which ones down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, of course, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and ring the notification bell so you get notified whenever I upload a video straight away. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you then.